Coming up on the Sarc Fighter podcast.
Because there were a number of components that we were hoping to see benefit. And in fact, we pretty much hit on all of them. So I think that's what has me just really thrilled at this point.
The Sarc Fighter podcast brings you the CEO of Atyr Pharma with exciting results on a new drug that shows promise in fighting pulmonary sarcoidosis. Even
some of the experts, when I've shown them some of the preliminary data, have been really impressed. And I do think that exceeding expectations here is something we have done in this trial.
Dr. Sanjay Shukla joins me to share all the encouraging results.
This is the Sarc Fighter podcast, living with sarcoidosis and other rare diseases. Here's your host, John Carlin.
Hi guys, this is John Carlin, the host of the Sarc Fighter podcast, and I do this podcast to offer my fellow Sarc Fighters hope. And I'll tell you what, there is a lot of hope on the table today. Results of a small clinical trial for a drug known as Atyr 1923 have just been released. It's hot off the press, and if everything verifies, it might be the first medication out there to possibly reduce prednisone as a front line of defense against sarcoidosis. This looks extremely promising, and we are going to dissect it today in very easy to understand terms, don't worry, on the Sarc Fighter podcast. I'll be talking with Atyr's president and CEO, Sanjay Shukla, MD, MS, in just a few minutes. But before we get to that discussion, I just got to tell you, as always, the official Sarc Fighter song is Zombie by Mark Steyer and his band, the White Hot Lizards from Alberta, Canada. Mark is also a Sarc Fighter, and his story is the story behind the lyrics that he wrote, and you can hear him and more about the song in episode 12. Occasionally, I will play the entire song for you at the end of an episode. I did that, I know, as recently as episode 41, so you might just want to go back and give it a listen. It's actually a very catchy tune. I call this the Sarc Fighter podcast because I'm fighting Sarc, and so are you, whether you are a patient, a researcher, a caregiver, pharmaceutical representative, as we have today with Dr. Shukla, and all of us gather here in the sarcoidosis space. So many people say they don't know anybody else who has sarcoidosis. They felt like they were all alone. Even people in populated areas like New Jersey are writing in or participating in the show and saying, you know what, I don't know anybody else with sarcoidosis. So at least with the podcast, you can hear the person's voice. You can, a forum is great. And there's a lot of good forums out there, but with the podcast, you hear the person's voice, you hear them speaking, you hear my back and forth with them, and you get to know that person a little bit, and you know where they're coming from. And what I've heard over and over is that just really helps people deal with sarcoidosis. I normally release the podcast every other Monday, and that has continued to be the case, and God willing, and the creek don't rise, as they say, we'll continue to do that. And as I'm speaking today, my trusty dog Dougal, the boxer, is curled up at my feet. And I have to tell you that Dougal was a foster puppy that we took in during the pandemic, and he just never left. So that makes dog number 3 for the Carlin family, but Dougal makes my life so much better. All right, I've got to tell you that I've been listening to a recorded interview with Sanjay that he did with investors in Atyr 23 who, they put their money behind this research, and so he was filling them in a publicly, in a recorded forum, which is public-facing information. And so I've been listening to this as he reported out the results, and then they had the opportunity to ask him questions. And then I've also been reading a transcript of those conversations. And I've been doing that in order to get up to speed on this and to help break it down for you and to ask good questions, or questions that you would want to ask if you were first hearing this information. So I want to take a step back. First of all, it was September 2020 when I first interviewed Dr. Shukla, Sanjay, here on the Sarc Fighter podcast. That was episode 17. And at that point, this podcast, the Sarc Fighter podcast, was just a few months old. And he came on. This was a new idea. It was a new concept. Yes, we had the backing and support of the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research. But Dr. Shukla said, you know what? I want people to know that we are putting this out there, and I want you to know that this is blind research, and we don't know what's coming back, but this is what we hope comes back. And so that was back in episode 17, and I appreciated his candor back then. And he thought that the drug had promise and that he would have more to say when they finished phase 1b/2a of this clinical trial process. And that basically is where they give the drug to actual patients in different doses. And some patients will receive a placebo or a pill that just looks like there's not a pill. In this case, it's actually an IV. But it's medication that just looks like the drug. But those persons actually don't get any of it. And then they also give different doses, different size doses to other people in the test, and each group gets, and Sanjay will talk about this, 5 milligrams, 3 milligrams, or 1 milligram of the 1923. And there are currently no drugs that have been developed specifically to fight sarcoidosis, and prednisone is the first line of defense. And you know that they have Remicade, they have methotrexate. In my case, I also took a chemo drug called Cytoxan. I now take Humira. But all of these drugs are off-label, as in they are usually given to a patient with other illnesses. But they have been shown to have some effectiveness in fighting Sarc, which means they are usually, honestly, only marginally effective or not at all, or they are effective but only for a small percentage of the sarcoidosis population. And of course, insurance companies are hesitant to pay for these drugs because they're quote-unquote off-label. So now there's a handful of companies out there, including Atyr, which are working on therapies that specifically target sarcoidosis. And they do receive funding in part from the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, and of course their investors and others. And there are a lot of investors who are now getting behind the momentum that's been generated by these recent findings here with Atyr 1923. But let's face it, here in the United States, we do have a robust pharmaceutical economy. We have some wonderful companies that are doing amazing work, and they are breaking through all the time in many different fields, not just sarcoidosis. But these companies do have to make some money, or they wouldn't risk the years of research and the millions of dollars it takes for them to look for these drugs. And you're seeing how long it takes just with this drug. So you get a feeling that it is expensive, and it does take a long time, and there has to be some reward for the risk that they're taking. So having said all of that, I can say that this is some of the most amazing information about a new drug to fight sarcoidosis that you probably will have ever heard. And I say that with a great deal of confidence. I want to back that up just a little bit. These are two quotes from the news release that went out to the public, and this has been published. The first quote is from a man that, if you've been in the sarcoidosis arena very long, you've probably heard of, Dr. Robert Baughman, professor of medicine and a pulmonologist at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. And Dr. Baughman says of these results, quote, "I am very impressed by this study, which is one of the best that I have seen conducted in sarcoidosis, a patient population that is highly underserved by current treatment options." And he goes on to say, importantly, Atyr 1923 demonstrated an improvement in several indicators of quality of life, a high priority for patients by a much larger margin than I would expect in a trial of this size and duration. So again, that's Dr. Baughman. Now, the next quote is from Dr. Culver, Dr. Daniel Culver, who is the chair of the Department of Pulmonary Medicine and director of diffuse parachemal lung disease at the Cleveland Clinic. and I'm not sure I said that word properly, but he is a part of my care team. I actually have never met him. He is the sort of the person who backs up the two doctors that I do have, at Dr. Ribeiro and Dr. Moss at Cleveland, but whenever they make a decision about my treatment, Dr. Culver is involved. So I guess it's curious that I haven't met him, but it just hasn't worked out on the times that I've traveled to Cleveland. The point is that he's also a huge name in the fight against sarcoidosis. And his quote is, "The dose response and consistent results across almost every endpoint are remarkable findings and as good as could be expected in this small study. The ability to taper patients off steroids while controlling disease symptoms in Atyr 1923 treatment groups is particularly compelling and supports advancement of Atyr 1923 into the next phase of development." So that's Dr. Daniel Culver, Dr. Culver at the Cleveland Clinic. So coming up, I'll have my interview with Dr. Shukla. I want to ask him to explain how 1923 has shown all this potential to make patients' lives better on not one, but at least two fronts, how the study worked. I'll ask him exactly why everybody is so excited about the results, and to have him document that even further beyond the two quotes that you've just heard. And believe me, it goes much further. I want to ask him what 1923 does when it gets inside the body, that it's been so remarkable. And then we'll be talking about what happens next with the development of the drug. And of course, most importantly, this is what we all want to know, when it might be available to Sarc patients. So that's coming up next here on the Sarc Fighter podcast.
I feel like a zombie, just feeding and stumbling.
Hi, I hope you're enjoying the Sarc Fighter podcast. You may be wondering, what can I do to help? How can I be a part of the sarcoidosis solution? It's simple. Make a donation to KISS, Kick In to Stop Sarcoidosis. 100% of the money goes to the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research. Look for a link in the show notes of the Sarc Fighter podcast. Welcome back to the Sarc Fighter podcast, and joining me now is Sanjay Shukla with Atyr Pharma, which has just, as you heard me say, reported some fantastic results on a new drug. And Sanjay, welcome to the Sarc Fighter podcast.
Thank you, John. I'm thrilled to be here today to talk to you about some of the work that we just put out.
So the new drug is Atyr 1923, and you and I have spoken about this on a previous podcast. In fact, I was looking, it was just exactly a year ago to the week that we first talked about this, and you were beginning the next phase of your clinical trial process. Why don't you give us a broad overview of what you've just reported out as you finished that first clinical trial?
Well, this was a trial, as you highlighted here, that we were currently engaged in, for several years. It was a patient trial where we were looking to enroll about 36 pulmonary sarcoidosis patients. We completed that trial late last year, beginning of this year, and we just put out the data from that trial. The data was really, in our eyes, impressive, outstanding. We're thrilled with the results, and I do think that we're really excited about progressing the program because there were a number of components that we were hoping to see benefit, and in fact, we pretty much hit on all of them. So I think that's what has me just really thrilled at this point.
Yeah, at some point, in some points of this, I think it's fair to say you exceeded expectations in terms of finding a new drug to fight sarcoidosis. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's very fair. I have to be honest that, some of the findings even surprised me. I felt as though we had a very good therapy that could be useful to sarcoidosis patients. But not only myself, but even some of the experts, when I've shown them some of the preliminary data, have been really impressed, and I do think that exceeding expectations here is something we have done in this trial.
All right. So Atyr 1923, one of the things that you are trying to accomplish with this is to reduce people's reliance on prednisone. Prednisone is the first line of defense. Something like 95% of all sarcoidosis patients start out with, and many stay on prednisone, and it has all kinds of terrible problems that we have discussed at length here on the podcast. So tell me how this compound is reducing people's reliance on prednisone.
Yeah, John, that is a great summary of really how we thought about addressing sarcoidosis, because the available therapy, as we all know, is really quite toxic and maybe even just poorly understood with regards to how much of a burden it puts on patients. It's a bad choice to have here, to be able to say, I need to be on this toxic medication to live my life. So one of the key components of our drug was, could we in fact alleviate some of that steroid burden? Could we be a type of therapy that patients could reduce steroids? It was one of our key objectives in the trial. Can we reduce steroids, and can folks manage sarcoidosis better with 1923, which we believe, and I think we've now shown, is a safer alternative to prednisone. That was a key objective. Really, really thrilled to report that when we looked at our data and our drug, we substantially impacted the reliance of prednisone. We really declined 50-60% reductions in that prednisone dose. And in our highest dose group, which was 5 milligrams per kilogram of ATYR, Atyr 1923, we showed a 58% reduction in the amount of steroids you need. So, for example, if you are taking 10 or 15 milligrams a day, sometimes for years, we've been able to say in this short trial, now you can throw away 5, 7, 8 milligrams of prednisone that you're every day, and you won't need that. So I think it's a fantastic step forward to say we're removing some of that toxicity that folks have to actually deal with every day. And by replacing it with our therapy, it's really a positive benefit.
Now that's amazing. Again, this is in a small group, and I know we'll talk by the end of the podcast about proving this even further. But that's amazing. And some patients were able to get off prednisone altogether. Is that correct?
Yes, another just outstanding finding in our trial, that we had 3 patients out of 9 in our highest dose cohort, which means the group that received the highest dose of our drug were able to get off. Again, it's a small trial, but to get a third of the patients completely off their steroids. These are patients that have been sometimes taking steroids for 5, 6, 7 years and have been trying to whittle down even 1 milligram. This was a just fantastic finding. We were hoping to see maybe 1 or 2 folks, if we saw something there, to get completely off steroids, but to see a third of that group, I'm really excited to test it further because, as you can imagine, this could potentially help tens of thousands of sarcoidosis patients get off steroid completely. So now you're talking about our therapy could be a potential steroid replacement. This is the first hint of that. And I think no amount of steroid, as I've been taught by experts, is really a safe dose. So I think this was just another great unexpected finding in our trial.
Yeah, and I listened to your conversation, which was recorded with investors as you reported this out, and I know that you were asked. You got 3 out of 9. And potentially it could have been greater. And the doctor wasn't really whoever the provider was for these patients wasn't really putting his foot on the gas to see if they could accelerate people off steroids. But for 3, it just happened to work out. But my takeaway from listening to that conversation is that it potentially could have even been more. Is that fair?
Well, we left it to the experts to a certain degree in this protocol that if folks were doing well, they had the option to go down further. So a huge component of our trial was, let's take everybody down to at least 5 milligrams. So if you started in the trial, you could come in anywhere between 10 and 25 milligrams. So right off the bat, you're getting at least a 50% reduction, say you come in at 10. Based on my observations, we saw some folks at 15 or 20, get down to 5. You feel great knocking down 10, 15 milligrams a day off that. It might be something in the protocol where we get, in the next trial we run, we get a little bit more prescriptive with the experts to say, let's try harder to get to 0. This is a new therapy. I rely on experts. I'm not a pulmonologist. I'm a clinician, but I'm not a pulmonologist. I rely on their expertise. They know the patients best. But I also think after this data is disseminated more in the medical population, you might see more receptivity, because now we've created some data and some evidence where people can look at that and say, okay, I've seen Atyr's initial data. Maybe I was even a primary investigator in the trial. Now I'm a little bit more of a believer to put the pedal down, as you said. I trust the engine here that we're going to be able to go a little bit harder. And I get it. This is the way drugs should be developed, in a careful, safe manner. And perhaps maybe some of those folks who were happy with that 10 or 15 milligram improvement might say, well, let me just try to go all the way in the next trial.
Yeah. Well, somebody who has had 2 big rounds of prednisone with as many as 80 milligrams a day, and having that just completely change and ruin my life, this is definitely news to celebrate. So now there's something out there that I want to talk about, and I'm going to explain it to listeners, called FVC, which stands for forced vital capacity. And basically what that is how much air you can breathe out of your lungs at a given time. And we're looking at a treatment at this point for pulmonary sarcoidosis. So the FVC is not something that the average person walks around thinking about, but doctors measure it. And you found improvement in people's lungs as measured by this improvement in FVC. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, John. And you've explained it really well. It is a objective measure that doctors, pulmonologists use to look at your lung function, or how are your lungs performing. And as many of your listeners are aware, with pulmonary sarcoidosis, you really have trouble breathing, shortness of breath, cough, things of that nature. Those are the symptoms. But when you look at actually the lung function, forced vital capacity is a measure in which, how are your lungs performing? Are you able to move more air in and out of your lungs? This is a important functional clue that experts and docs look at. We were looking at this in our trial. What we expected is maybe a slight improvement. That this is something that we weren't necessarily banking on a large signal, if you will. We wanted to make sure it certainly didn't worsen forced vital capacity, but we also had some rather remarkable and really unexpected findings with forced vital capacity. We saw improvements in lung function that were above and beyond what docs would consider to be significant. And it's a significant improvement that they might have expected over a course of a year. In our trial, in 6 months, you were seeing percentage improvements that experts would consider fantastic if this was done over the course of a year. And one expert said, this is working rather fast to actually get people's lungs performing better. So that has me really excited to think about this a therapy that not only is, first off, reducing steroids, but you're also seeing in this important objective measure that docs look at, you now are also seeing lungs performing better. So to me, it's, those two things, you start to stack those two things together. It's really a powerful signal.
All right, I'm going to show my ignorance here, I think, but I want to ask this question because my understanding of most of the drugs that pulmonary patients take, their job is to just slow the worsening of their condition, if I understand correctly. And your drug not only slowed the worsening, but crossed that line into improvement. Did I say that right?
100%. The medications that have been approved in lung disease, these sort of interstitial lung diseases, typically have been approved based on their ability to slow down the worsening, which is important, especially in diseases, for example, like IPF. But they have rarely shown I can think of maybe only one instance in a trial where they showed some improvement, and that was nominal. Our therapy, we wanted to make sure it didn't worsen. So we were stunned that it's certainly not doing that, but you're seeing benefit. You're seeing improvement of lung function at levels that those other therapies were approved by the FDA. 2.5% less worsening got some of those therapies approved. We're showing 2.5% more than that, 3.3% actually in our highest dose improvement. Those numbers may not mean a whole lot to patients, but when docs see that, they say, wow, you not only are staying well ahead of those placebo patients, but the folks on your therapy are seeing some positive, substantial positive benefit. And I think that is something that really was also, as I said, very notable in our trial.
So now we're talking about clinical numbers and so forth, but I just want to ask you straight up, did people feel better when all that stuff happened? Were they just the walking around every day, eating breakfast, feeling better?
Yeah. And that's, in many ways for me, not being an expert, if you will, I always look at that first. We can say the drug had all these effects, it got down steroids, you start to see things on forced vital capacity. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of folks just say, look, is this going to actually impact my life? And we looked at a number of important symptoms that patients deal with. Shortness of breath, cough, fatigue, just their general health. Looking at different surveys over the course of the 6 months. And there we also had a really, really positive benefit that our higher doses saw, again, substantial improvements in the ability to control everyone's day-to-day fatigue, their shortness of breath, their cough, their general health. All of these measures trended all in the positive direction. And what I'm really proud of is these improvements were not subtle. We were using symptom scores and measures that have been well validated for sometimes 20 years. And the docs look at the level of improvement that is being reported. And again, they were surpassing levels that they would consider just sort of artifactual or just sort of within the noise that, yeah, people are feeling better. We are seeing levels that, not to get too technical, are beyond what a doctor would say is the minimally clinical important difference. So when you start to basically say, oh, it improves your fatigue, it's doing so at a threshold of this symptom score that is, again, something that an expert will look at and say, wow, that's actually happening fast. And this was anecdotally what we heard in our trial, that patients were really happy with the therapy and they were performing really well. But it was really gratifying to see that also translate some of these other findings we saw, that in all of those measures, we saw what I'm saying is substantial benefit. And these are the things that, if you're living with this condition, you're thinking about every day. Am I going to breathe better? Am I going to cough less? Am I going to be less fatigued? These are really important measures. We're digging into other things like, your mood, your insomnia. A lot of those steroid effects I expect to also be dealt with. If we can get people off steroids, we should also, it just makes sense. You should see positive benefit. Maybe if we run a longer trial, we're even talking about all that weight gain that you get with, it's early on, but that's something that we could look at, long term, because we know that if you're on steroids for years and years, it also wrecks your, metabolism. So these were the measures that we looked at, and it correlated, really, really well to especially in our highest dose had some real positive benefit with those symptoms.
Right. So you've mentioned the highest dose several times. You had 37 people, I think, in this program, and some of them received the placebo. Some of them received 1 milligram of 1923. Some received 3, and some received 5. And if you could just compare those results for me, did the people who got the most medicine see the best result?
Essentially, that's correct. That's called a dose response. So of those 37 patients, 12 patients received placebo. And that, first of all, that's a really important element I want to point out. These patients really contributed to this data, knowing that they had a 33% chance or so of getting placebo. So I'm extremely grateful and thankful to those patients who frankly tolerated maybe being made unwell for this period, but it allowed us to really then tease out these effects. We then had essentially about 8 patients or so, give or take a patient here or there, in each of those treatment groups that you pointed out, 1 milligram, 3 milligrams, and 5 milligrams. This is a drug that is administered once a month through a 1-hour IV infusion. And what we saw is essentially, as you might expect, placebo patients seem to decline a little bit. You see worsening of symptoms and even forced vital capacity. Our 1 milligram dose seemed to be what I would call subtherapeutic. Maybe some things happening there, but it kind of looks similar to placebo. So we didn't really see too much move, maybe a couple things here and there that I can look at and say, well, that's good. But then when we got to 3 milligrams, that's when we started to really see that improvement with lung function, symptoms, steroid reduction. Then when we looked at 5, it was even better than 3. So that is called a dose response. So that is something that, as you can look at things and say, do you see a dose response? Is the highest dose offered? Because then you can imagine, okay, you can attribute some of that positive benefit to the drug and the drug effects. What I especially like is we saw this dose response, 5 being better than 3 and 3 being better than 1, across all of the things we evaluated. Things like forced vital capacity, which makes the docs really interested, steroid reduction, which was what I was really interested in, more and better reductions in the highest dose. And then lastly, symptoms, as I just talked about, also all those things, cough, fatigue, shortness of breath, performing much better in 5, good in 3, and 3 better than 1. So this is lined up really, really nicely for us, and it gives us a lot of confidence in the drug activity signal we see, and we call that in clinical trial terms a dose response. And now we've demonstrated what is called proof of concept. Like we actually have a drug that's active here.
Yeah, that's just fantastic news, and I'm so excited about this. On behalf of all the sarcoidosis community who's listening. So when we have sarcoidosis in the lungs or anywhere in our bodies, you have this immune response where the body is sending white blood cells, which then become globules, to a spot in your body that doesn't really need it. And when that happens in your lungs, it basically clogs up your breathing. Fair?
Essentially, yes, that's fair.
So how does 1923 undo that? What's it doing in our bodies that makes it such a roto-rooter?
So yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I remember the Roto-Rooter commercials.
Right.
As a kid yeah. So I think we do know that these clumps, as you point out, develop in different organ systems, and sarcoidosis, 90% of the patients get these in the lungs. And sometimes just not only in the lungs, it can also be in other organs, but most patients see these clumps in the lungs. What those clumps do beyond just being things that are really, targets there and basically they shouldn't be in that organ system, they create a target of inflammation. And your body goes into a state where it says, hey, I got to clear this out. This shouldn't be here. What that does is it creates a cascade of a lot of inflammation. So inflammation is why patients are given steroids. You got to control all that. There's an aberrant response of our own body's immune system here. We don't know why, but that's what's happening here to respond to this clump that shouldn't be there, which also we don't know why that's happening. So what our drug really is doing, and what we saw for many years, is it had some powerful ability to really calm down immune cells. It was effectively a immune policeman, if you will, that it basically said, hey, you know what, guys, get out of here. Like we got to resolve this. And we saw it in particular with certain types of cells, T cells, macrophages. These are the types of cells involved in trying to basically resolve something here in this disease, but might be actually contributing to these patients feeling sick. So our drug we saw early on had some really nice effects. It's basically resetting that sort of inflammatory response. We followed that up with obviously testing it further in more animal type models, and we felt really good about, okay, this is a good anti-inflammatory. Then we progressed looking at healthy volunteers, and that showed the drug is safe. So we believed that this was going to be a really potent immune resolver, if you will. We call it an immunomodulator, but really resolving some of that sort of aberrant inflammation that you see in the lungs. And we thought we would do a better job and a safer job than steroids. So that was a real premise here, because we also knew that what patients are taking to control this inflammation is toxic. So if we can do a better job at addressing that and not have toxicity, well, then we think that's what could be a really game-changing type of therapy for patients. So this trial was very important for us to test a lot of theories. And as I said, we're just thrilled that much of the concepts we debated and the objectives of this trial read out in many ways exceeding, as you said, our expectations.
Okay, so it's working. So now you've measured 1923 in your group of 37 people, and everything looks promising. But it's not like the FDA is going to say, all right, go for it, start marketing this drug. You still got to do another test, right? So what happens next?
Correct. So this was essentially a phase 2 trial, which is what that means is that's really the trial that is you run in patients to see if the drug is actually doing anything. And I think we squarely can say confidently, yes, it is. It is doing something, and it's really beneficial. But statistically, you have to be able to what is called power a trial. You have to basically say, now let's look at this in a larger group of patients. So you see companies move into a phase 3 trial where you basically try to replicate what you saw in a small amount of patients, in this case 37, in maybe hundreds of patients. And then if you can do that, statistically, you can show that this is just not an anomaly. So where we are now is gearing up for a much larger phase 3 trial. That will be something that I will, with my team, negotiate and plan with the FDA. And we want to move fast because patients can't afford to wait. Can't afford to wait a day. I think with the signals that we have produced here, we have already generated a lot of interest worldwide from experts. I was on the phone this morning with someone in the Netherlands who really wants to sort of get involved with this next trial. And, we're going to do things in a very, ethical and a careful manner, working with worldwide regulators, because we've now got to prove it in a larger number of patients. And if we're able to do that, I think we are on the way to potentially having the first therapy to get approved in sarcoidosis in maybe ever. I think
there isn't anything right now that's been developed just for sarcoidosis or because of sarcoidosis.
Right. Which is really, our mission at a company like Atyr is we look at how can we take our technology, if you will, and position it in areas where patients really need something better. And that was always my idea when we launched this program. I think we have a real opportunity here to make a major impact in an area where I know firsthand, with the few instances I've been exposed to sarcoidosis patients in my short clinical practice, it's something that, we can do better here. We can do better than steroids, and let's really see if let's test it. Let's make sure it's safe. And let's also make sure the things we see improve also are meaningful to patients. We talk about really trying to create meaningful medicines at Atyr. And I think we might have one here.
Yeah. Well, let's hope. So now, when you and I are speaking in September of 2021, you're going to report these findings. Everything that we're talking about now will be examined in much greater detail in medical journals and so forth. Will you do that reporting while simultaneously starting the next trial, or what order? How does this work in the medical world?
Yeah, there's no resting now. Now we got to move. So yes, we will look to get more of the data, all of the data, fully out there in hopefully a major medical journal or even a symposia at the next medical conference. But in parallel, immediately, Atyr is taking steps to move forward with a larger trial. We want to demonstrate and validate all of these findings. So we are going to be aggressively moving forward to talk to, as I said, the FDA, but also even other worldwide agencies. We have a partner in Japan, Atyr Pharmaceuticals, that is chomping at the bit to start using our therapy in a trial over there. Those experts would like to actually test 1923 in Japanese sarcoidosis patients. So we will work in conjunction with now worldwide leaders and regulators to start a worldwide trial. I think I would anticipate this being at a minimum in the US, Europe, and Japan. Potentially other countries could get interested. And the goal here would be to enroll, as I said, potentially several hundred patients, and then hopefully be able to see, if you see similar findings than what we saw in this 37 patient trial, then we could potentially be on our way to an approved therapy.
Yeah, that's great. So I had a couple other questions that I'll work in, but since we're on it right now, when do you think Atyr 1923 might be something you can walk into your doctor's office and be prescribed?
Yeah, that's the key question here, right? And I wish I had a really tight answer and also an answer that is something like, hey, right away, next year. It's going to take time. We're going to have to, it's a journey to develop a drug. We are going to start this trial next year, but as it's a larger trial, it can take several years to enroll that trial, administer our therapy, test it. It might be a trial that is a year long. and then you have to read out the results, and then you have to go back to the regulator. So it can be, I know it can be a frustrating process, but this is the way you ethically develop a therapy carefully and cogently to do it this way. So, our projections are we would start a trial next year. It can take several years to enroll and run that trial. I want to be in a situation where maybe in that 2024 timeframe, 2025, to be able to sort of have an important data set that justifies approval. I know that might not be what some of the patients listening to this want to hear, but I can tell you this. Sometimes drugs, it can take more than 10 years to get approved. We're more than halfway past that. I tell my team, when we swam out, on this journey, I can't now see where I left, but I can see the shore ahead of me. And having done this with some other therapies, we're more than halfway there. And I also think this was just a major point here where we had to show something. And it was, as I said, it's a major inflection point in, yes, there is a drug. So the 6 or 7 years we've been working on this, that's behind us. Now we can actually, I think, as I said, see that sort of shore in front of us. And I'm going to keep swimming as hard as I can to get there as quickly as I can.
Gotcha. I'm a former marathon runner, so I would have used a marathon instead of a swim, but that's okay. But I can also tell you that when you run a marathon, halfway is not 13 miles out of the 26. Halfway is 20, because that's when you tend to run out of steam. I hope you don't hit something at 20 that you don't anticipate.
No, you're right about that. Yes, I mean, I think I am invigorated. The team is really invigorated when you see data like this. And I also think the worldwide medical expert community is getting invigorated. And that's all going to help us to potentially push through those last 6 to 12 miles, right? You need to have that. You need to have that ahead of you to sort of fuel you to get to that end. And we have a great team in San Diego, working really hard to now power up. We're going to that station with the power bars that you like to when you run by, John, and we're going to keep on trucking here and keep moving forward.
That is awesome. So now I'm just curious, and you've tested this in the lungs, but I have kind of a two-pronged question. Is there any possibility, like for instance, I have neurosarcoidosis, but I am treated by a pulmonologist because he's the guy that's most familiar with Sarc. So is there any possibility that it could work in other parts of the body as well as it does in the lungs?
There's a possibility. I can't say for certain because we are testing it in the lungs. I can tell you in the next trial, we may have the ability to sort of open the tent to, if you do have, say, pulmonary, but you have other manifestations, extrapulmonary disease in, say, the heart, for example,
right?
There might be the opportunity to include a broader subset of patients. Because again, once you start to demonstrate safety and you move things along, regulators say, okay, how can you do this? How can we impact the most amount of patients here? So some of this will be a discussion with the regulators. I certainly would postulate that if one of the major drivers of disease are these clumps in your lungs, well, maybe over time, you also start to see improvements in extrapulmonary disease. But I can't say for certain, John, because we haven't tested it.
Sure.
But I think it's a great sign that the major, what's called phenotype, the major manifestation in sarcoidosis itself is pulmonary. Well, then, I would hope that patients with extrapulmonary disease would also start to maybe see some benefit. But I haven't tested that. I haven't looked at those patients specifically in our current trial. But it is something in the next protocol that we may be able to, for example, enroll folks with, say, cardiac sarcoidosis, and see if their heart function improves, see if their imaging of their heart looks less problematic, less inflamed. So that's something that I'm quickly working with experts to determine the best course to, as I said, include more of a tent of folks who need better therapies.
Yep. And then how about people who have problems in their lungs and it's not caused by sarcoidosis, but it has a similar manifestation? Any potential there to maybe help with some other diseases? I mean, all the drugs that we take for Sarc were developed for other reasons, and they just happen to also sometimes help Sarc patients.
Absolutely. I mean, I think right now, those other pulmonary experts who may treat, for example, a scleroderma patient that now has lung disease, that's another related form of inflammatory lung disease, interstitial lung disease. And, broadly speaking, there's maybe 200 of these diseases, but there's 3 or 4 major buckets of interstitial lung disease, one of which is sarcoidosis. But there's other large areas of interstitial lung disease. For example, if you have some form of scleroderma or rheumatoid arthritis, it can start systemically, but then unfortunately, some of those folks could have lung damage, and the damage doesn't present in these clumps, but it's the same sort of symptomology. You have trouble breathing, you have a lot of inflammation in your lungs, hard to breathe, cough, fatigue, and then what do you get? Steroids. There's other forms of interstitial lung disease, things like something called hypersensitivity pneumonitis, where you can get exposed to sometimes environmental agents that, cause your lungs to react really aggressively and poorly to these sort of environmental agents that are sometimes in certain occupations, for example. What happens? Your lungs start to become more inflamed, maybe you become fibrotic. What do they rely on? These patients have to take steroids. So all of those conditions are areas where we can now look at and maybe potentially even benefit a patient who has, say, scleroderma, who also has interstitial lung disease, because our hypothesis on how we basically modulate and control lung inflammation could readily be applied in those conditions where, again, steroids are maybe the only thing that docs can reach for to help those folks.
Great. Again, it's very early. We don't know, but wouldn't it be wonderful if sarcoidosis was helping somebody else instead of somebody else helping sarcoidosis? Just in very broad terms. Yeah. So now I know, like, for instance, when I was taking Remicade, which was an IV drug that I took for a time, my body eventually started building up antibodies. So when my liver enzymes became elevated and my care team said, we've got to get you off of this and onto something else, is that something that you've been able to test for in your limited run so far? Or, is there any downside with respect to your body building up resistance?
So this is a very important question, and it is something that we assayed, we tested and looked for in our trial. It's almost a requirement that the FDA requires that, hey, we just need to know if the body is creating these sort of what are known as anti-drug antibodies, because that can happen sometimes. I'm happy to report we did not see a signal of that in our trial. And remember, our patients are receiving our therapy every month, and in our trial, it was for 6 months, so 6 doses. So that was an important safety component in our trial. And sometimes if you develop these antibodies, they can, sometimes not be problematic. They can just be sort of just hanging out there and they don't impact you. What I can tell you in our trial is we did not see a concerning signal of anti-drug antibodies. And this is something that, portends well for us in the future. It's always something you have to keep an eye on, however, when you use these sort of therapies, and which is why Remicade is an approved therapy, also didn't have too many concerning elements to get approved. But then if you're a doctor, you have to still follow it, because you can have a patient that, develops an adverse reaction in that manner, and you have to monitor things like that. So this will be an active monitoring for our next therapy. But I can tell you, in this trial of these 37 patients, we sailed clear of any concerns with anti-drug antibodies thus far.
Great. So you really didn't see any major side effects from 1923?
No, I mean, I think that's another great thing to be proud of is, with all these great effects we're been talking about, you got to make sure the drug is safe. And from my analysis, our team's analysis, we really did not see any real concerns from a safety and what's called tolerability standpoint. The sort of things we see are actually consistent with just with sarcoidosis, with pulmonary sarcoidosis. People reporting cough and shortness of breath, things like that. But of course, you can imagine you saw more of that in the placebo population. So we're reporting everything here, and just in the same way where you want to say, hey, I'd like to see a drug with a dose response, with 5 being better than 3 and 3 being better than 1 and 1 being better than placebo with regards to some sort of activity. You want to kind of almost see the opposite when you think about safety. You want to see the bad things more in the placebo group. And largely speaking, it's a small trial, but largely speaking, we see that. We don't see spikes of anything weird in the treated patients versus placebo patients. And anything you do see is attributed to, it's not related to the drug. It's
related to the disease.
Mostly just related to the disease. So it's one of these things to say, okay, this has been collected, but that's fine. This is not something that you see a huge spike of worsening. I just told you cough and fatigue, things like that improved. So you can imagine that if we did see some of that, well, it makes sense that if the placebo patients were being taken down on steroids, you're going to see things there. But overall, the safety profile is the trajectory of the safety is good. And that's one thing that the FDA in particular in a phase 2 trial, you got to make sure you have that. Fine, your drug is active, but no concerning safety signals. It's really important that we have that box checked. Sometimes that's overlooked because people want to focus on the activity. But as a drug developer and someone who's worked in clinical trials quite a bit, sometimes drugs with fantastic findings, you uncover something new and prickly from a safety point of view. And we don't want that to occur because patients shouldn't have to deal with some safety manifestation and make that trade-off. We want to make sure this drug is safe all through the development and even after.
Right. And you and I have had this conversation before during a panel discussion, but I think it's before we wrap up, a good thing to point out. You're on the record as saying that if prednisone was introduced, because it's been around for decades, but if it was introduced and discovered just today and going through this process, it would never be approved, right?
Never. No. You would look at those early animal studies and see all the things it did to rodents with weight gain and irritability and cardiovascular effects and it would muscle wasting and all that would be readily understood, and they would say, okay, we're done. It's not going to be approved. So my viewpoint here, and I think I'm going to be right, and I won't be around, but maybe I'll be around, but 50, 100, 150 years from now, we'll be reading in medical textbooks that, they used to use this sort of poison. I call it poison because I think it is poisonous over time. And this is what we used to use. And what were we thinking? And this was something I said on that panel. And I said it more lightheartedly, but it's true. It is true that if whether you're taking 5 or 50 milligrams, there are deleterious effects to steroids that, again, I'll use that same refrain. We need to do better. We need to do better and have a better alternative rather than steroids.
So let's put a bow on this. Phase 1B, 2A clinical trials of Atyr 1923 have shown promise And if you would just sort of qualify and quantify what this might mean for the sarcoidosis community in wrapping it up.
Sure. I think we have shown substantial improvement in objective and subjective measures. We have seen substantial improvement in symptoms, lung function, ability to take less steroids. We've also demonstrated that the drug is safe. And we are moving forward. And really now, the therapy that is the furthest along, perhaps worldwide, and closest to being approved. We still have some work to do to confirm these findings in a larger study, but we are very, very excited at Atyr to progress to the next stage with a therapy that we hope eventually can get approved once we show that in the next trial.
All right. Sanjay Shukla, CEO of Atyr Pharma, thank you for joining me on the Sarc Fighter podcast.
Thanks so much, John.
I feel like a zombie, just feeding and stumbling.
So thanks to Dr. Sanjay Shukla for the interview. If you want to hear the original interview where we took that deep dive into how 1923 works at a time when we really didn't know if it was going to work, please go back and listen to episode 17. That was my first interview with Dr. Sanjay Shukla. And there will be a link to that in the show notes so you don't have to do such an exhaustive search through our website. But here are the takeaways for me. I've got 10. I'll do this really quickly. If the drug lives up to its promise, it'll be the biggest development yet in the fight against sarcoidosis. At this point, on this day, at this time, I think we can say that. Number 2, it can reduce our need for prednisone, and you all know how dreadful life on prednisone can be. Number 3, it actually improves patients' breathing as opposed to just slowing the worsening of lung function. Patients actually get better on this drug, at least so far. There appears to be no side effects. That's number 4. Number 5, there's no indication the body's immune system develops an immunity or an ability to fight off the drug, which can often happen with drugs in the category called biologics. Number 6, people just plain feel better. Take away all the medical terminology and patients just walking around living their everyday lives said, you know what? I just feel better. Quality of life improved, and that's a huge takeaway. Number 7, it may be effective in fighting other similar diseases. Very premature, but it may. All right. Number 8, we're not there yet. A bigger study and perhaps a worldwide study, as you heard Dr. Shukla say, needs to be undertaken, the results analyzed, and then, only then, can Atyr pitch it to the FDA for approval. And once the FDA approves it, then there's the potential for us to have this drug available for our own treatment. Number 9, you heard Sanjay say things like 2024, 2025, as maybe the times when, if everything goes according to plan, the drug might be available. So number 9 is don't throw your prednisone away yet, unfortunately. And number 10, we should note that the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research has played a role in helping to get this and other similar projects launched. These other projects, of course, not as far along yet, but in terms of getting them off the ground, that's one of the things the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research does. Okay, a couple of other notes. Please don't forget to go back and listen to the bonus episode on sarcoidosis and COVID, because I think that's still relevant. There's also another bonus episode on dealing with prednisone, and Dr. Shukla was one of the panelists. I moderated that roundtable discussion. These were, as you've heard me say before, rare opportunities where all the top experts in the field were in the same room at the same time, and we got to ask them questions about sarcoidosis and COVID, and now they're talking about the third shot, for instance. And I don't have the answer as to whether you should get a third shot, but I know that This is one of the types of things that's coming up with COVID right now is, okay, I'm immune suppressed. Am I in that group that's supposed to get the third shot? And I will get an answer for you on that as soon as I can find someone to answer it definitively. But even the government experts can't agree. But the bottom line is that COVID is still relevant, and we did have a roundtable on that. And again, I'll make it easy by putting links in the show notes so you don't have to do this exhaustive search. Please send me an email. It's in the show notes, carlinagency@gmail.com. Follow the Sarc Fighter on Instagram and on Facebook. And I do appreciate your interest in the podcast. If you'd like to be on the podcast, please email me and tell me your story, and we'll talk about it. And whether you're a caregiver, a patient, a researcher, no matter how you come to the sarcoidosis space, I would like to hear what you have to say and to evaluate the possibility of you coming on. If you like this podcast, please tell just one person. Share it on your social media and let people know about the Sarc Fighter podcast, and give it a nice review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again to Dr. Sanjay Shukla for appearing here, and more importantly, for all of his hard work in moving forward the evidence and the case for Atyr 1923. Until next time, keep fighting.
Learn to suffer, you feel pain someday. Learn endurance, your strength will fade away. Dead man walking, trying to keep up the pace. Dead man